Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Tucker Edmonds, and I am the Associate Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the sixth episode of the fourth season of the Center's Religion and series. Religion and is a series of monthly conversations between leading academics and practitioners hosted by the Center to engage and enhance critically important conversations on the state of religion in America and in this contemporary moment. The last episode was an engaging and really deeply probing conversation on religion and war. I want to thank Ray Habersky, Mary Ellen O'Connell, Sam Moyne, and Kate Timoney for their very insightful and thoughtful contributions to this important conversation. If you didn't get a chance to catch it, please check it out on our YouTube channel or go over to our webpage where you'll have the opportunity to not only rewatch the episode, but to look at resources that are found in the show notes that are curriculum guides, that are other articles, and other opportunities for you to engage the conversation of war, religion, and the possibility of peace in your classrooms and throughout your communities. I wanted to just let folks know that the goal of all of these episodes is to start a conversation and then to carry them out into your classrooms, into communities, and through conferences throughout the country and hopefully around the world. So one of the ways that we do that is that every 2 years, the center hosts their biennial conference, which is called our Biennial Conference for the Study of Religion and American Culture. And this year, it will take place from June 13th to the 16th here in Indianapolis. Registration is open on the center's website. We are going to have panels that range on everything between religion and non-religion to Latinx religious diversity, to thinking about religion and politics, and even going back to and thinking more about some of the conversations around religion and protest, and even a new conversation that we've never had before at our conference about religion and disability studies. So please think about joining us and check that out. It is open for community, graduate students, as well as faculty who are engaged in the study of religion and American culture. Please remember that throughout today's session, we are asking folks to submit questions through the Q&A feature on Zoom. This will enable our host and panelists to engage these questions as they facilitate this important conversation. This afternoon, I would like to introduce our moderator for what I'm sure is going to be a rich and wide-ranging discussion examining religion, sports, fandom, race, capital, and American culture. If you looked at the introduction for this episode, we were talking about the fact that both religion and sports are these huge enterprises where all of the issues and questions about American culture, about race and capital and belonging all interside, collide, and exist. And today we have folks who are coming on today to talk to us about religion and fandom, religious experience as a part of the sports world, and this understanding about how on our fields, our courts, our pitches, and our turf, that we are engaged in the practice through sport of creating and exporting American culture. So I'm so excited for the conversation and the panelists that we have today. I want to introduce our host, who is a professor at Indiana University, Indianapolis. It used to be called Purdue University, Indianapolis. Dr. Jennifer Guiliano. She is a professor of history, and she is also well known at our university as the guru of digital humanities. Dr. Jen, as I call her and some of our students refer to her, is one of the persons who really has done an amazing job throughout her career and as a scholar, tying together and really creating a thread between thinking about the critical and theoretical work that is done and bridging that to digital humanities, digital cultures, and creating not only the implementation of that, but the historical engagement of that work and how it shapes the work that we do. She's also known for for her 2015 monograph, Indian Spectacle, College Mascots and the Anxiety of Modern America. She is well positioned to lead and moderate this conversation today. And so I will hand it over to her to introduce the rest of the panel.
Thanks, Joseph. And I want to thank the Center for Religion and American Culture for putting together this incredible panel. We'll first introduce our panelists, and then we've got some prepared questions to get us started. As Joseph mentioned, feel free to use that Q&A feature. The more questions you have for our panel, the more lively and engaging the next 50 minutes will be. Our first panelist is Dr. Annie Blazer. She's an associate professor of religious studies. Her courses cover religion in America from the colonial to contemporary period. In particular, her courses investigate the relationship between religions and American culture, paying attention to race, class, gender, and sexuality. Her first book, Playing for God, Evangelical Women and the Unintended Consequences of Sports Ministry with NYU Press, was released in 2015. The book is an ethnographic exploration of the religious experiences of Christian athletes in the U.S. Professor Blazer is currently working on her second book, American Culture Through Religion and Sports, which is under contract with Bloomsbury Press. Wave, if you will, Annie. Great. Our second panelist is Dr. Jeffrey Scholes, who is a professor of religious studies in the Department of Philosophy and the director of the Center for Religious Diversity and Public Life at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. His research intersects the center of relationship between religion and sports in American political theology. He's the author of Vocation and the Politics of Work, Popular Theology in Consumer Culture with Lexington in 2013, Religion and Sports in American Culture with Rutledge in 2014, Christianity, Race, and Sport with Rutledge in 2021, and co-editor with Randall Balmer of Religion and Sport in North America, Critical Essays for the 21st Century with Routledge in 2022. All that aside, he's actually working on a new book on religion and sports fandom. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Scholes. Onaje Woodbine is our third presenter. Dr. Woodbine's research explores the varieties of Black religious experience, especially as they are lived on the margins of power and outside the bounds of established institutional authority. His most recent book, Black Gods of the Asphalt, Religion, Hip Hop, and Street Basketball, garnered national praise as a, quote, profound narrative of survival and self-determination in this season where Black male bodies are under attack, end quote. Covered by the New York Times, NPR's All Things Considered, and ESPN, and the National Catholic Reporter and Boston Magazine, if that's not a weird and unusual spread of presses. His book reveals a world of redemption and hope rarely glimpsed from the outside. Black Gods was long listed for the 2017 Penn ESPN Award for Literary Studies Writing and was named one of the Boston Globe's best books of 2016. So thank you for joining us, panelists. We're so excited to have you. It's March Madness, so this is the perfect time to have this conversation, but it's also tournament season for lacrosse and all of the other winter sports that are sort of coming through. So I wanted to actually start us a little bit with the history that sort of hides behind a lot of the conversations that are going on. So the starting point for many people when they think about religion and sports is considering the role of organizations like the Young Women's Christian Association, the Young Men's Christian Association, Athletes in Action, Fellowship of Christian Athletes, sort of the organizations that communicate and use sport to communicate faith. How do those organizations utilize sport as a vehicle for religious education, and sort of how do you think those organizations do their job, I guess? Annie, if you don't mind starting, that would be great.
Would love to. It's such a great question, Jen, and the answer is slightly different for different organizations, but I'll talk a little bit about contemporary sports ministry organizations like Athletes in Action and Fellowship of Christian Athletes. I spent a couple of years doing ethnographic research with these organizations and paying attention particularly into how they use sport to educate young Christians about gender. So one of the things that is true of evangelical Christianity and is also true of sports is that these are gender segregated spaces for a lot of participants. And because they are gender segregated, they are also spaces where people learn how to enact and perform their gender. And this is really becomes complicated for female Christian athletes because when men perform the masculinity of sports, they are adhering to gender norms and gender expectations. And when women perform the strength and power of sports, they are working against the gender expectations of their community and also larger American culture. So when I do think about sport as a form of discipline, as a way people learn how to be in the world. And for contemporary sports ministry organizations, they want to, when they're working with female athletes, they want to encourage female athleticism, but at the same time conserve that gender roles that restrict women to often supportive roles. And so it is a tricky tightrope for women that are members of these organizations. And we see things like, one thing I found in my research that's interesting is that sometimes these women find these spaces of sports ministry to actually be more freeing than spaces of secular women's sports, because there's a sort of protection of belonging to an evangelical women's sports club or team, where they don't have to showcase their femininity to prove that they are straight and Christian. Simply by being a member of these organizations, they achieve a form of sort of gender protection. And that allows actually for more experimentation than you might find in other spaces. So that was one interesting thing that I found in that research.
Is that true across racial boundaries? I mean, is it the same for Black women and white women, or Latinx women and white women and Black women in your research?
I can't speak to that. These organizations are, the ones that I worked with are majority white. There are evangelical organizations that specifically target and work with African-American athletes and Latinx athletes, but they weren't part of my field work. So I wonder if others have senses of what goes on in those spaces.
That's wonderful, Annie. Thank you so much for that contribution. I can't necessarily speak to the question of women, particularly Black women, within some of these organizations. But historically, I'll say that, particularly in a sport like basketball, I'm aware that the YMCA was a racially segregated institution for quite a long time. And in the early 1900s, Black athletes, especially Black basketball players, had to form their own physical culture movements and clubs in order to gain access to some of the physical health benefits and cultural benefits associated with sport. And the Black church played an important role in sort of the genesis and evolution of sport and physical culture within Black community in America. And particularly, there was a confluence of Black culture with sport, music, dance, and religion in the early 1900s, so that, for example, in New York City, at the Harlem Renaissance Ballroom, you would have jazz music being played, Lindy Hop dancing, and then they would put the hoops in and they would play with the same kind of style and aesthetic sensibilities. So these institutions, the Black church, infused their own cultural and religious ethos into sport from a very, very early on, and played an important role in the evolution of sport within the Black community.
Now, I would add too, first, thanks for having all of us to talk about religion and sport. I think the formation of the YMCA and the YWCA early on, and the YMCA in particular in the mid part of the 19th century in Europe, England in particular, and then later on in the United States, coincides intentionally with the Industrial Revolution, both in the United States or in England and Germany, and later in the United States. But there was religion kind of comes into play with the kind of unifying religion and sport with this phenomenon called muscular Christianity, and to kind of leave out muscular Christianity from one of the major impetus behind the development of the YMCA. Later on, AIA, Athletes in Action, FCA, and other groups like even Campus Crusade for Christ and Young Life, which you see more in the 20th century. But a lot of it had to do with the suspicion that men were becoming feminized in factories. and so take from the farm and into factories, and therefore athletic activity, whether it was organized sport or not, later on it kind of develops into organized sport, where we see development of professional baseball and basketball and football and hockey. But if you could in a sense, like over in a hyperbolic way, masculinize Jesus and in a really large stretch say that Jesus was athletic, therefore it would ideally, hopefully, kind of remasculinize these cityified young men. Teddy Roosevelt was a massive proponent of this in the early part of the 20th century, in more of a secular way, but nevertheless, there were countless pastors that decided the YMCA would be this burgeoning and later massive entity that combined faith, a certain form of Christianity, with athletic activity. So it's just kind of one historical way in which there are remnants of muscular Christianity certainly in play today. I mean, without any question, it's just it was much more explicit as this kind of nervousness and kind of hand-wringing from women and men in the 19th century that helped get really organized sport off the ground that involved men almost exclusively early on. But just want to say that at least.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Jeff, because I do think like the anxieties of muscular Christianity were about cities, but they were also about immigration and migration. So you had during this era, the turn of the century, you had really high numbers of Jewish immigrants and Catholic immigrants, and this is also towards the end of the Great Migration, where you've got Black folks from the rural South moving to the urban North. So muscular Christianity is born out of this white male Protestant anxiety about how to maintain dominance through when things are changing. And I absolutely, contemporary sports owes a lot to muscular Christianity. Muscular Christians invented basketball. They invented volleyball. We owe the YMCA for having swimming pools across the country. We also owe the YMCA for telling us that sports turns boys into men, that sport builds character. These are things that the YMCA, that muscular Christians emphasized. And then as now, there has no, if sports turn boys into men, what do they do for girls has sort of become an ongoing struggle for thinking about the role of sports for women and girls, which is different than the way that the sort of easy combining of sports for men and boys.
So one of the things that strikes me as I listen to you all talk, I mean, Gail Biederman's analysis of muscular Christianity, a lot of the things that we're thinking about at that turn of the 20th century moment was very much about sort of disciplining the body, right? And we know that there are very specific connotations to disciplining the body in sports context versus religious context. And I wonder if you could think a little bit about that for our audience. You know, when we think about the rules and regulations that are being codified into sport and the sort of rules and theocracy of religion, you know, how do those two things sort of overlap for you when you think about, you know, that early 20th century moment?
I mean, I would kind of go back to a reference point that many pastors to this day use. One of the very rare mentions of sport in the Bible is Paul in 1 Corinthians, where he's talking about, he's saying, hey, let's talk about something that we're all aware of, like a marathon race, right? But he needed to use the kind of metaphor of a physical race to talk about the real prize and the real race, which is a spiritual life. So sport oftentimes is used as this very kind of obvious example that we're all familiar with. However, let's then clearly state the limits of sport to order to make a spiritual point or something, as Paul says, a laurel that will not die, right? As opposed to the laurels gained in the Olympics or other races. So sport is kind of used as a foil and an instrument in the past to make this larger point. And I think that's one way in which it's been dealt with in a kind of hierarchy. Religion and spiritual stuff is up here. Sport and other secular activities are down here. I mean, I think all three of us have attempted in one way or the other to eliminate that hierarchy, or at the very least be able to say that, there's different things that religion can learn from sport and vice versa, as opposed to just using it instrumentally to make some larger point about itself. I don't know if that's kind of getting at a little bit of what you asked.
Yeah, Jeff, that makes a lot of sense. And I think one of the positive, in a sense, contributions of muscular Christianity is the notion that that there are other ways of knowing the divine that involve feeling the body, that go beyond belief, go beyond rationality, and so forth. And I think thinking about religion in terms that are not necessarily Western text-driven, belief-driven ways of framing religion, that we might draw from other religious traditions that center the body, non-Western traditions, African-based traditions, Eastern Asian religious traditions, I think is a helpful way in which at least muscular Christianity begins to point sport in that direction.
It strikes me too, as we think a little bit about this, that, you know, we're talking about sort of the positive side of sport and the positive side of sort of organized sport. But I do want to highlight for us just a little bit. There was a question from the audience about these sport ministries sort of potentially negatively contributing to virtual development and moral formation. You know, is that something y'all have found in your research, that as much as we sort of see the positive side of sport, there's also this sort of, you know, negative or more dark side of the game as it intersects with religion?
100%. I mean, I think it's so, having spent this time investigating sports ministry, one thing that I encountered that I don't think sports ministry has yet figured out how to grapple with is that the message of sport and the message of evangelical Christianity are incompatible. The message of evangelical Christianity is that salvation is open to everyone. Whether we like that message or not, that's their message. And then the message of sport is that there's a winner and a loser. So a sport is hierarchical. And sport is about sorting people into different levels of achievement. And that is, it is, when you, the trying to combine these two things has really had evangelicals sort of going in theological cartwheels, trying to make these two things go together. And so theologically, it's really a tough ideological combination. There are other ways that sport really resonates with evangelical Christianity in terms of gender roles, in terms of American nationalism. There are other sort of things that you can see the appeal, but if you're trying to boil it down to like, what is the ethical lesson of these two different worldviews, it's not easily compatible. So I think, and then I think in terms of negative repercussions of sport, you know, muscular Christians invented this idea of character. This is a thing they invented. Sport builds character. There's not any evidence that sport does this better or differently than other ways of people engaging with people, like being in the marching band, being in the school play. There's no evidence that sport is significantly better at this than other things. And there is a lot of evidence that sport can lead to questionable ethical decision-making when it comes to performance-enhancing drugs, when it comes to not paying attention to your body's pain limits because of the pressure to sacrifice one's body for the team and for victory. And then I think we've also got a really weird situation in the US where sport is this sort of vehicle to get to college and to get to a success story. And that puts a lot of pressure on athletes participating in sport to prioritize it over other things that might give them better skills to succeed after their sports career, which, because as we know, many people's sports careers are limited. Elite sports careers are limited. So that's some of my initial thoughts there, Jen. Thanks for that question.
I would just respond to a couple of those points. I think you're right, obviously, that sport is a microcosm of the social world. It mirrors all of the hierarchies we have in the rest of society. But I do think there is an egalitarian dimension to sport, that collective effervescence that sometimes happens amongst teams or individual runners or folks involved in individual sports. And maybe that has something to do with the level of commercialization or not based, in a particular sport. I'm thinking about playground basketball, for example, where the audience are really participants, and there's a call and response tradition there, and a real connection, communal connection that I think transcends some of the hierarchies that they experience in the streets, outside of the game. So a broader understanding of sport, I think, would include some of the hierarchical dimensions you're talking about, but there's also a sort of a bottom-up approach to sport, in some of these communities that I think is important. And then the other thing I'll mention in relation to that is in relation to healing and trauma, because there's some research, Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a neuroscientist, who's looking at sports like skateboarding and other sports, and thinking about the repetitive rhythmic quality that is associated with sport movement and its connection to soothing the limbic system in the brain, particularly amongst traumatized youth. He argues that before you can get to some of the more complex traumas associated with talking and thinking, that sport helps to soothe youth through this repetitive movement, and then allows the therapist or practitioner to then communicate, some of these more complex traumas. So I think there's a role for sport in relation to trauma and healing that is important as well.
I would add
sorry,
too
go ahead,
that I would only add that when we talk about religion and sport, sometimes we have to kind of clarify: are we talking about athletes, teams? Are we talking about fans, right? Because there's interaction, necessary interaction between the team and the fans, but fans is something I'm interested in as a fan myself, and I'm interested in writing about it too. But there's also, maybe, Jen, to kind of touch on what you're trying to get at, perhaps this kind of a discrepancy or even a hypocrisy for, say, for instance, committed religious people to pull for and be fans of certain sports, if there's the kinds of behaviors that Andy was referring to. I think that many people who are religiously observant and very serious about it, and why they're maybe able to give sports a pass and become a fervent fan and not have it conflict at all or compete with their own conviction, is that sports historically has been known as kind of this apolitical space. Like, it's just people playing a game. And therefore, that's not true, but this is the way in which oftentimes it's thought of. And so therefore, there's no conflict seemingly with a lot of people to, be in Sunday morning, asking forgiveness and praying and humbling yourself. And then later that day, watching the NFL, guys beat up on each other. So I think it's one reason why these kind of levels of, say, hypocrisy or tension within kind of a religious person who's a hardcore sports fan don't register, and perhaps they should, but sometimes they don't, because the way in which sports is kind of thought of almost on running on a parallel track to one's own. I mean, some politics is thought of in a similar way by a lot of people as well, but sports in particular, where it's supposed to be a kind of a colorblind meritocracy where no matter who you are, if you can play and do well, you should be able to play, and therefore it's somehow egalitarian. That's also not true, but nevertheless, that's the way in which it's largely conceived, and therefore it's devoid of ideology and values, and it's just playing on all that. Again, it's not true, but it allows, I think, people to relieve or eliminate some kind of moral tension within them to be a hardcore sports fan and a religious person.
So let's dig a little bit into that. So, there are all kinds of examples of sports and religion coming together in protest movements and in sort of, open statements from athletes, religious gestures from people like Steph Curry and Gabby Douglas, Russell Wilson, and others. Oh, excuse me. Is there, how is the line drawn for who's allowed to make those gestures and who's not? Right? Is there a line for what is an appropriate gesture of faith for athletes versus an inappropriate gesture of faith for athletes today?
I mean, I think one really interesting way to compare athletes making gestures is to think about Tim Tebow versus Colin Kaepernick, where Tim Tebow's, sideline kneel becomes a sort of meme that people think is kind of quirky, and they integrate into their lives, and it becomes this thing called Tebowing where everybody's fine with it. And Colin Kaepernick's kneeling then incites really incendiary rhetoric and people burning their shoes. And it's just a really different reaction to these two men who are both football players. And one is white and using this gesture in a religious way that Americans recognize as religious. One is Black and using this gesture in a way that Americans want to call political. And so I think that, of course, Tebow's gesture is also political. So I think that's one really interesting point of comparison. I'll also bring up that for some Muslim athletes, their gesture of religious celebration has not always been recognized as such by referees, and referees will call it excessive celebration and penalize it, but they would not penalize a religious gesture that they recognized. So there's also some stuff going on there about, whose gestures are whose gestures go without comment and whose gestures become inflection points.
I would say too, kind of along the lines of what Annie's talking about, even kind of along racial lines, like I wrote about this in another book, where what I'm calling kind of like a soft providentialism, where someone like Tebow will pray for strength or no injuries or something intangible that God is still purportedly intervening into the game in some way, as opposed to kind of a hard providentialism where there are people giving credit before and after the game for God, guiding the ball into my hands, and God wanted us to win the Super Bowl. And Russell Wilson, after a NFC Championship game, I think it was 2014 or 15, back when he was good, he not only credits God for this really wild win over who did they beat? Oh, the Packers, Aaron Rodgers and the Packers, but said that these kind of tribulations that Wilson was experiencing the first half were God testing Wilson, and therefore overcoming that by the end of the game and winning was a sign that God won't put anything in front of you that you can't. But God directly influenced that game. But what I found is that in particular, when those kind of hard providential statements are made by African-American athletes, there's much more of a hue and cry from the media, from even religious leaders about, how dare Ray Lewis suggest that God does care who wins the Super Bowl, when Tim Tebow is making very similar statements about God interceding into history, but those are much more acceptable and palatable. And it almost falls exactly along racial lines, just in my kind of investigation of it. And I should say too, there are either softer ones, like there's kind of a glorification model where we're playing for the glorification of God. That's a common safe expression. Or even just kind of like a billboard where Tim Tebow used to put like just a Bible verse on eye black under his eyes when he played for Florida. Or now the NFL allows like a couple weeks in the year where you can put something on your shoe. They used to not allow that. But Steph Curry has a Bible verse on the tongue, the inside tongue of his shoe. These are ones that are meant to provoke and ideally make you go look at the Bible verse, I suppose. In fact, after Tebow had the Bible verse, like that Bible verse itself was Googled like some crazy amount of times after he did. So it worked, but he doesn't have to state it. So there's these more kind of subtle ways of combining your own faith with this platform that sport allows that are much more acceptable, oftentimes along racial lines, as opposed to other kinds of expression that are considered like crass, and God would never involve God's self in the mess of football or basketball or anything like that. But there's a difference that kind of makes a difference. But
wow, that's fascinating, Jeff. Yeah, I kind of think of these gestures as sort of acts of resistance from these athletes, and it is so interesting to think about all of these gestures as kind of cultural texts that kinds of significations that are read differently based on your positionality, within the landscape. And I think one interesting motif that comes out of Africana traditions is the notion of the trickster or the signifier, whose practices tend to be read literally by outsiders as, having to do with often you're talking about Black men or women is acts of aggression or some kind of, racial implication there. But from the interiority, the subjective perspective of the athlete themselves point to something else or to something more. And so there's always this sort of double reading that you have to do when you're trying to interpret some of these practices.
Yeah, there've been two Indigenous cases recently that have gotten more coverage. Kyrie Irving sages the court where he plays before he plays. And when journalists found out that that's what he was doing, they had to start including language in their articles explaining to people what saging was. But also we've seen a couple of different examples this year in women's basketball where the haka is performed. You have female athletes who are from New Zealand who are Maori, and the haka is their families coming to perform the haka in honor of their sort of playing and their achievement in graduating college. And there was an article this week talking about, this player from, I think it's Utah, and her family coming to perform the haka. And, there had to be 3 paragraphs of explanation of what the haka was, and that the gestures that seemed so aggressive to white audiences are in fact not aggressive in their cultural context. And I think, one of the things that when we're thinking about religion and sport and the interplay between them, I do think it's really interesting that the cultural context becomes so vital to understanding not only the community's sort of engagement with religion and sport, but the long-term generational sort of investment in that. And I'm thinking here about, Onaje, you're talking about, playground ball and things like that. Those courts are 20, 30, 40, 50 years old. I mean, people's grandparents and grandchildren are playing on those courts. And I have to wonder a little bit in your research, how does sort of generational investment in religion and sport play out?
Oh yeah, that's huge. That's huge. Around these spaces, you usually have multiple generations of athletes and families who share the story, share the narrative, share the cultural history, and inform the meaning of what goes on in those spaces. To give you an example, in my research, a lot of times elder women are sitting in lawn chairs around the street ball courts. And when there's a death in the streets or something negative happens, a lot of times people just know that this is one of the spaces where we go to grieve, where we go to deal with that generational trauma and that social trauma. And there are many instances in my work where somebody would go to the court after a friend had died or had been, injured badly, and they would play in the memory of this person, and the elders, usually the women, would automatically express sort of empathy. There'd be this call and response, and then this cathartic release at the end. And so they would play a huge role in sort of the collective technique of healing, in this space. So yeah, I think that if we can think of this as a ritual, I think that it wouldn't necessarily work unless the elders were present in informing, the ritual practice.
Jeffrey, does that play out in fandom similarly, that fandom is generational in its construct?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, not every time, but I think if you find like diehard, rabid, let's say Packers fans, chances are there's a parent or a grandparent or both sets of intergenerational fandom that's just been in your blood since you were born, or you're wearing a Packers onesie when you're a baby. Right. And therefore a lot of memories, early memories for children that grow up is like, I remember the first time I went to a baseball game with my dad. right? And that has kind of been seared into the memory of, and for a lot of kids, boys and girls, but a lot of boys will say it was kind of the only thing my dad and I could actually talk about, right? Was sports. It was safe. There was passion from the dad, but anything else, you know, there were either problems or dead. But sports becomes this, without any question, this intergenerational thing. So therefore, fandom of a certain team is tied into so much other stuff, familial, which involves religion certainly too, but oh, no question about it. Yeah.
And I just want to add ancestors. I mean, huge. Talk about generational memory
Right.
and that sort of thing. Huge influence. Communication, dialogue with I don't know if anyone's seen the Chris Paul 61-point game that he had as he was 15 years old. His grandfather passed away, and he tries to score 61 points for every year, a point for every year of his grandfather's life. He does it, he falls out, and he says, you know, I feel like I died and went to heaven. And at that point, it's hard to distinguish him from his grandfather. And in many, you know, indigenous African traditions, they have a part in a funeral where the living replay the dead's life in quick succession. And they call it dreaming because it allows the spirit of the dead to dream its life through the living one more time before departing to the spirit world. So I don't think it's any coincidence that in many sort of African-American expressions of grief in sport, given the cultural context with African slavery, that ancestors play a major role in those practices.
I'm also struck by, you know, when we think about that dynamic of ancestors playing a role, that sport itself is very much about overcoming the previous generation's achievements, right? That part of what I think is very interesting is the notion not just of you being your best athlete or being a diligent Christian, being a diligent Muslim, whatever the religion is that you follow, but it's also about, you know, that sort of working towards becoming better than the generation previous. So I just spent my last weekend at the Division I women's basketball championships in Ohio. My niece is a senior, and they were playing in the state semifinals and finals. And so much of the language was about, it's the first time we've been here in 46 years, and you're going to be better than this team, and they're going to break these records. And I'm struck a lot of times that there's so many similarities in the sort of conversations from sporting fans and sporting athletes about achievement and religious conversations about achieving a better self, achieving a better role in life, you know, becoming kinder, being more community driven. You know, what do you all think about this notion of sort of an everlasting or an ever cycling toward progress sort of rhetoric that imbues both sport and religion?
I think that's absolutely accurate, but I think with both sport and religion, another way in which it's tied is there's always this reminder, sometimes in a scolding fashion, to remember the past. And so whether it's kind of a myth story that informs religions that one must never forget, in sports, especially along the level of not only fandom, but, you know, LeBron James has to reference Michael Jordan continually in order to give props to show that he is respecting his elders and past myth or lore. Or if you're a Mets fan and you don't know about the 1986 Mets World, like you're not a Mets fan. So there's progress for achievement and winning, but it has to be attached very quickly to a memory or at least a studying of the past. So, you know, to some extent. So it's kind of both and. In other words, you can't progress in a certain way if you don't know the history and that person and all that stuff. So it's both and in religion and sport, I would say.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, to comment on that, I think there is a sort of statistical obsession with sports and the record keeping of sports and who's going to break the record and how they're going to break the record and all of these things. And I think it is, we've gotten to a point in our technological development and also in our training of athletes that I think that is working in a really negative fashion where pressure on, for example, female gymnasts to be very, very tiny in order to compete and also on female sprinters to really deprive their body of nutrients so that they can be very small. And one thing that does is it often stops menstruation or delays puberty, and these can have really long-term negative effects for women. And then similarly, in sports for men, where bulk is a really important facet of success, you have a turn towards undetectable performance enhancing drugs like human growth hormone, that we don't know the long-term consequences of that use. But because we have a sort of cultural and maybe global obsession with record breaking and always being better with who came before, this can really cause people to go to use unhealthy measures in order to achieve those maybe unrealistic ideas.
So I want to remind the audience that you can enter a question into the Q&A. One of the questions that actually came in, I don't know how familiar you all are with the 1955 Crispus Attucks basketball team here in Indiana. So Crispus Attucks was a historically Black school here in Indiana. And in 1955, it ends up making its way to the state finals, where they're playing basically what is effectively an all-Black team versus an all-white team. And I want to sort of pause for a minute. So one of the more interesting things, I think, is that, in that case in 1955, it very clearly was driven by segregation. And yet today we have similar examples of segregation that are just sort of as prominent or as sort of visible, right? So certain sports are perceived as being Black sports versus white sports, or Latinx sports versus this. I have a colleague who writes about lacrosse and sort of says, it's very unusual that we will see anyone other than a white folk, depending on where you are in the country. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the ways in which, race, gender, and class are sort of playing out when we think about children, and specifically sort of, elementary school, middle school, high school students, and the relationship between parochial and non-parochial schools. Is there are there different dynamics operating in sport based on whether the child's at a public school versus a private sort of non-secular school?
Well, one observation that I think Pierre Bourdieu makes is, as you say, how disciplined sport is based upon class distinctions, and particularly in relation to the body. And so, he points out that sports that involve the body, heavy physical exertion, the closeness to other bodies, and, forms of aggression and violence tend to be, associated with the lower class. And as you move up, you become more socially mobile, you deal with sports that become much more individualistic, but also that use an instrument in place of the body, or, an animal, or in the case of golf, an actual human being in terms of a caddy. And so, I think that's a really interesting way to think about sport in relation to class.
Yeah, just to build on that, one of the reasons that basketball became really popular across the US was because you didn't need a whole lot in order to do it. Like, you just needed a space that was big enough to play and some baskets, which is really different than golf, where you need a ton of space, or even baseball, where you need there's equipment needs and also space needs. So basketball is invented in the 1890s, and it's popular across the US in cities, and predominantly with immigrants and with African Americans, because there's so few resources needed. And then that sort of legacy, I think, gets carried forward as well. And we can also think about sports that were associated with the elite, like tennis, It's sort of there, again, there's some space and equipment requirements that are really different than than other sports. Another example would be running. Running, you don't need very much equipment at all. And so and also boxing. Boxing becomes associated with immigrant communities and African American communities, similarly, because there's so little equipment needed. So I think there's also just sort of the cost of the sport itself is going to be part of what then becomes a sort of a congealed narrative about who belongs in what sport.
So as we move towards, we got about 8 minutes left. One of the large sort of through threads right now in athletics, particularly in organized athletics, is gambling. And I wonder a little bit about the relationships or observations you may have about the relationships between prohibitions on gambling in organized religion and the sort of massive infrastructure of gambling that has arisen in organized sports. I mean, you literally can't watch a broadcast now without some sort of advertisement from BetMGM or with other, other sort of gambling things. What is your sense of, is there a tension there that operates between organized religion and organized sports in terms of the sort of support for or I guess dismissal of gambling as an outlet?
I mean, I think gambling is interesting when you're talking about kind of specifically sports fans. Obviously, these major sports organizations have been a little slow on the uptake to not only honor it, but to have sponsoring, DraftKings and these other big organizations. But I really kind of view the explosion of gambling by it being legalized in a bunch of states and these internet companies kind of popping up that make it very, very easy. But for some, it's kind of a new way of orienting yourself as a quasi fan to sport, mediated now obviously by money, and that then also can potentially distance oneself from you're pulling for a team for really odd reasons. It's kind of like with fantasy football.
Yeah.
It's an extension of fantasy football where there's real money on the line like almost every quarter. I mean, you can put money on odd things during game with your phone. So it's not like the bookie, you have to go to some dark alley and pay a bookie some money. So it's the ease, it's the explosion, therefore it's kind of ubiquitous. And as a result, I wonder, because I guess the evidence is not there, as to whether certain kind of religious prescriptions, historically speaking, against gambling are either going to soften, or there is somehow kind of a way to say, well, it's kind of more like fantasy football, or who knows? I mean, it's still gambling, right? It may look different in the way in which money's paid out and the kinds of things you can bet on, but it's not only still gambling, it's probably there's data for this. So many more people who are doing it. So therefore, in a weird way, it's more of a quote problem now than it likely was 20 or 30 years ago. However, it's unclear whether religion will have a similar kind of critique of it that it has historically had. I'm not sure.
One thing that I'm paying attention to is changes in the name, image, and likeness policies. So I think it's appropriate that college athletes are able to profit from their name, image, and likeness, but there are restrictions on what they can promote. And some of those restrictions are in state law, and some of those restrictions are coming from their institutions or from the NCAA. And in sort of an overview of a lot of these restrictions are, you can't promote adult entertainment, you can't promote marijuana, even if marijuana is legal, and you can't promote gambling. And this is really interesting because I think that's the one that's going to get legal challenges because of how ubiquitous gambling is now in sports. So I'm just paying attention to that over the next, I'm predicting over the next 10 years, we're going to see that those NIL laws change again and let college athletes promote these gambling companies.
Only thing I can think of is in relation to the political economy of indigenous religions, the ones that I study in West Africa, in which there is some kind of monetary exchange or expectation for spiritual increase or enlightenment or work. And there's a similar thing going on, I think, in some of the street basketball that I've explored, where you have gamblers always around the space, and the stakes are really high. The person may be trying to connect with an ancestor or spirit, but also attempting to win because they know that the gang member is there. And so it really heightens the stakes. So there is some sort of exchange, I think, between spirit and monetarily that happens that I think is permissible in some sense in some indigenous contexts.
Yeah, I should also mention too, I mean, historically, we have lots of examples of numbers runners actually owning teams. And
True.
New York has a long history of its athletic clubs, being part of that milieu. Chicago is the same way. One of our audience members said they'd be curious to hear your perspectives on how religion can attenuate performance-based identity, mental illness, or pressure in sport. When does religion sort of amplify those problems, or when does it sort of pacify or ameliorate concerns around mental illness and sort of a performance-based anxiety?
Yeah, I think of a much more of a preponderance and a permission culturally for athletes to have more candor around mental illness. I think of Michael Phelps or Simone Biles in particular around the Olympics, because the level of stress and the potential for like not a lot of money coming in, even if you win like the silver but not the gold, is so high and so ridiculous. But historically, especially with men, but also with women too, haven't been kind of permitted to be honest about why you need a break, right? You had to make up something. So there's much more of a less of a stigma, in particular with these big time athletes like Simone Biles and Michael Phelps and others in the NFL and NBA that you're hearing much more from. I'm not sure exactly how that will alter the relationship between kind of religion and mental health around anxiety in sports, but at the very least, it's something to notice that it's invited more athletes to be more comfortable talking about this incredibly high stress thing that they're all doing. And now it makes more sense to like regular people like us going, oh, well, okay, good. You get anxious too. You must, right? But it's taboo to talk about it, but now it's not as much, it seems.
So we've got just 1 minute left. I want to ask one final question of you all. So, when we end these sort of sessions, religion in sessions or other sort of panels, I always want to ask the question, what is the next frontier in religion and sport? What is that next question you as a scholar are trying to answer, either for yourself in your own research or for the community that you're part of? Annie, do you mind going first?
Yeah, I think I asked my students the other week what makes a good coach, and they listed a whole lot of really like affirming things, and one thing that was not on that list was winning games. And I was like, what needs to change in our culture so that coaches can do those things without being evaluated on this thing? And so I think that's what I think is the next frontier, is how to make sports, how to lean into the moral value of sports by reassessing how we value it.
Onaje.
I think for me, it's how non-Western metaphysics, religious traditions can help us understand better sport as a spiritual practice.
Nice. Jeffrey.
Yeah, I think for me, it's kind of just a deeper look at sport as not only a quote secular entity, but to also look much more closely at religion and its tie to secularism as well, and therefore not really equating the two, but I think being able to use sports and growing sports fandom, which is just so crazy, to tell us some things about religion, which is usually that path. Sports not about religion has not been the more common avenue as religion can tell us or critique sports. So I'm kind of hoping it goes back in that direction a little bit.
So I want to thank all of you for spending your time with us. I want to thank the Center for Religion and American Culture and all of the panelists. This conversation can continue online. So this episode will be available on YouTube on RAAC Tube as the key link. There'll also be a link available to you coming in email, as well as a survey of this particular session. I want to thank all three of you for being so generous with your time and energy and being candid about the relationship between religion and sport. And I hope that you'll join us for a future session of Religion and.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.